Now to look at SharePoint workflows. As I've mentioned a couple of times, SharePoint workflows are incredibly useful and powerful inside of SharePoint deployments, but are often overlooked. Let's look at some of the reasons why you should consider putting your custom code and your custom processes into a SharePoint workflow. One of the pieces that has been a challenge with SharePoint in the past has been some of the difficulties of scaling workflows. SharePoint 2013 adds scale with a workflow manager and actually allows the implementation to run its own workflow server. This allows the workflows to scale much higher than were possible in previous SharePoints, and also able to push further along. So if you've got a workflow that may take up to a year to run, previously you could kind of get clogging of the arteries in SharePoint with lots of workflows in a stalled state or in a stop state, waiting for a situation that may not come along for longer periods of time. So with SharePoint 2013 and the workflow server, all of this is happening off of the SharePoint deployment itself if you choose, and therefore you can actually dedicate resources to managing that to whatever scale you wanted to. If you wanted to actually have that running on a high CPU, high RAM server, then you could actually have a very, very high volume workflow server passing back and forth. That being said, you continue to support SharePoint 2010 workflows. So if you've got a situation where you have a lot of workflows, if you have been scaling with SharePoint 2010 workflows, those move over into SharePoint 2013. You can support those without any changes whatsoever, and you can actually gather those in and use some of the additional scaling capabilities of 2013. So you're looking at both in your existing workflows, if you've got SharePoint 2010 workflows, or your new SharePoint 2013, you're able to scale up to a much higher level with SharePoint 2013 than you were before. So know that you've got those capabilities in place, that things have moved forward, that you are looking at a much higher level of scale with workflows in this current version of SharePoint. Also, I'm just going to note that traditionally SharePoint Designer has been working with multiple types of workflows. With SharePoint Designer in 2013, traditionally you're working on attached workflows, but with the ability in the new workflow to be able to take workflows and create templates and to create those highly scalable workflows, now you have the ability to use SharePoint Designer through the entire cycle, rather than kind of starting with the design, doing an instance of it, of a workflow in SharePoint Designer, and then needing to step back into Visual Studio to actually make that workflow scalable. You actually have the capability of doing SharePoint Designer, attaching those workflows, and once you get it the way you are, actually doing that adaptation right there. So it makes your tool set a little bit easier, and it does mean that if you've got people that are used to working with SharePoint Designer, they can now make those highly scalable workflows, rather than now pulling in some of your dev units or using up some of your dev licenses for Visual Studio to create those additional scalabilities. As far as the scope, traditionally with SharePoint, we've had workflows being able to attach to just about anything. The workflows started out just on document libraries, but have rapidly expanded to be able to attach to anything that's considered a list in SharePoint. So since everything is a list in SharePoint, you're in good shape there. So knowing that you can pretty much use workflows in pretty much anything. If you want to attach a workflow to a reference column, if you want to attach a workflow to a user membership group, all of those kind of pieces, you've got all that capability to go in there. And with workflows able to call other workflows, you can actually chain them to be super, super complex. That's one of the big challenges as you get very comfortable with workflows, is trying to make sure that you don't make them so complex that those who follow behind you will have challenges to understand them. So just be aware of that when you're going through the workflows as well, but know that your scope is that you can actually tie workflows to anything that is a list in SharePoint, and that those workflows can work with anything that's a list, plus call things that are outside of your SharePoint environment. Workflows can be single attached with SharePoint Designer, and this is kind of traditionally the way that SharePoint has done the one-off workflows. When you go into SharePoint Designer, and we'll do this in a demo, you can actually create a workflow directly attached to a list, or you can actually create templates off of those as well. So this is new in SharePoint Designer 2013, that you can actually create those scalable workflows in there. That being said, Visual Studio creates workflows, and with Visual Studio you can actually, as I mentioned in the solution section, create the package those workflows up with the solutions so they can be deployed regularly. With apps, you can actually tie in with workflows both by manipulating information on a list that the workflow is attached to, and actually using the object model to call the workflows directly through the workflow service. So you've got a couple of options there. Workflows work well by themselves, but they also work very well with a SharePoint solution or with a SharePoint app. So being able to tie in with just about everything makes workflows really valuable in your deployment. And with SharePoint 2013, you want to be aware of how the Workflow Manager works. It's got a lot of new capabilities. With the scalability point, the management tools have become much better. But that being said, if you've already got a organization that's working with some of the independent software vendors who provide additional capabilities around SharePoint Workflows, say K2 or Nintex or some of those partners, know that ties in just as well. So you've got a lot of capability with managing the workflows. The maintenance is there. A lot of it's going to depend upon which tools, but you have a lot of choice in tools to make sure that the maintenance goes forward. Visual Studio provides debugging capabilities, so you can actually go in and do some attaching and see what's going on with those workflows and kind of follow it through, just like you would expect with Visual Studio. And then with SharePoint Workflow Interface, it's still available for the user and site administrator access. So your users can still work with workflows as they can do manual kickoffs or things like that. The site administrators can go in and do attaching of workflows to items or to lists or to whatever they're looking at doing. They can actually do some modifications to various initialization pieces. You've got a lot of different capabilities inside of SharePoint to provide that maintenance that we're looking at. So very maintainable. You'll hear a lot of people being concerned about this. This is something that was a challenge in the past with SharePoint. So just think about it a little bit, open it up and take a look at get yourself a good maintenance plan before you go into workflow, but you'll be very pleased that you did, and you'll be very pleased with the results.